This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Kelly Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Honda and Nissan officially begin merger talks to form the world's third largest automaker, which could happen by 2026 under a holding company. South Korea's main opposition party is turning up the heat on acting President Han Duck-soo, threatening to impeach him if he doesn't launch a special investigation into President Yoon Suk-yeol's failed martial law bid. And more than 1,000 North Korean soldiers have been killed or wounded in Russia's war with Ukraine. That's according to South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff. And China sounds the alarm, warning the Philippines of a potential arms race after Manila announced plans to acquire a US-made mid-range missile system. Also in East Asia tonight, Vietnam's largest defense expo wraps up with Hanoi signing millions of dollars in equipment deals amid heightened regional tensions. It's official. Honda and Nissan have made public the highly anticipated details of their merger. Well, a new holding company will combine the two giants of the Japanese auto industry, and talks are due to conclude in the middle of next year. And of course, lots more details that will concern shareholders. And Roland Lim is standing by to break it all down for us. So, Roland, what else do we know?
Well, Sally, markets have been very keen to hear how these two titans of auto will merge. Now, in its simplest terms, Honda and Nissan will form a new holding company by June of 2025. The two companies will then delist from the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and the newly formed company will list in its place in August of 2026. Now, the two firms, along with Mitsubishi Motors, said they had signed a memorandum of understanding to start discussions on integrating their business. Mitsubishi will decide by the end of January 2025 to see if it wants to join the merger. Now, even without Mitsubishi, the collaboration between Nissan and Honda will create the world's third biggest automaker. But emerging details show it's unlikely that this will be a marriage of equals. Now, Honda will nominate the president of the new holding company, whose board will also mostly be made up of Honda executives. Even before the announcement, the stock of the two auto giants had been one to watch, investors pushing the stocks into the green before the markets closed. Nissan ending the day up 1.6%, nearly, Honda up 3.8%. And we'll have to wait until tomorrow to see how Japanese markets react to the news today. Meantime, Honda's CEO denies the company was coming to the rescue of rival Nissan. But have a look at this chart. When we compare the stock moves, clearly Nissan shares reacting more to the news, and that stock is up a whopping 28% the past 5 days. In comparison, Honda's stock price is down 1% these past 5 days. And for more details on this merger, we're joined now by CNA's very own Michio Ishida in Tokyo. Michio, good to have you on the show. As always, Honda and Nissan just held a press conference a couple of hours ago. What did management say? What were the main takeaways?
Well, as you know, Honda and Nissan officially announced they will begin to discuss their integration after much speculation since last week. And Mitsubishi Motors will decide whether to join the merger by the end of January. And if Mitsubishi joins, its president Takao Kato said it will bring its strength in the ASEAN market and in small pickup trucks. Meanwhile, Nissan needs to turn the company around. Its midterm earnings fell drastically based on its earnings report in November. Its CEO, Makoto Uchida, said, through the partnership, he is committed to lay out the path for the future. Now, Honda CEO Toshihiro Nibe separately announced it will acquire 1.1 trillion yen worth of its own shares, and each company will be responsible for steering its own company for now. The aim is to increase production, focusing on intelligence and electrification. This is not about reduction and efficiency, the leader said. But Mr. Nibe did not rule out the possibility of a fallout after formal negotiations.
And Mitchell, of course, a lot of reaction to their plans. What have the analysts been saying? What's the level of optimism?
Well, what some analysts are saying is that this merger is seen as a merit for Nissan as it's been in financial trouble. Its midterm earnings fell drastically and announced it is cutting production by 20% and aiming to reduce staff by 20% worldwide, or 9,000 people. And its market value fell to number 6 among Japanese automakers. Now, this is a shock as Nissan has constantly been one of Japan's top 3 car makers. The core of the problem, which auto analysts point out, is Nissan does not have an attractive car model. Some analysts say Taiwan's Foxconn's speculated move to buy Nissan accelerated the plan for a merger. Foxconn's EV officer is former Nissan COO Jun Seki. But Mr. Uchida denied this during the news conference. Now, Honda has been an independent car maker, unlike Nissan, whose biggest shareholder is Renault and Mitsubishi Motors is partner. Some analysts think Honda has to think about its future to stay visible and sell its vehicles to compete against China, now the biggest car producer spearheaded by its EVs.
Mitchell, it's no coincidence that ex-Nissan CEO Carlos Ghosn, now a wanted fugitive exiled in Lebanon, had held a press conference earlier the same day to give his personal take on the merger. And he wasn't positive.
Well, Mr. Ghosn said he was actually surprised when he first heard of this integration. He said the two companies have similar strengths and weaknesses everywhere. He said it's a duplication. And he doesn't see any promises in this alliance. He thinks Nissan doesn't have a vision, but perhaps from the Japanese government's point of view, it's a good move because the government can be in control. Now, Honda and Nissan had to seek the government's approval before announcing this MOU. Now, remember, Mr. Ghosn escaped Japan in a carbon box after being arrested and in bail for financial scandal. He spoke from Beirut to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. Now, he's the man who turned Nissan around after taking over in 1999. In 2018, he was arrested. In 2019, he escaped Japan, hiding in a carbon box. But interestingly, during his online conference, he said he rides a Nissan.
Okay, we will be watching developments very closely. Thank you, CNA's Michio Ishida, reporting live from Tokyo there. The looming merger between Japanese car giants Honda and Nissan is part of an ongoing shakeup in an auto industry disrupted by China's electric vehicles. The US and Europe have moved to stop the flow of China-made EVs and their weapon of choice, import tariffs. But is adding distortions to an already distorted market the best way to level the playing field?
This is no ordinary karaoke. They're members of a Telegram chat group in Singapore, and everyone here has bought tickets to join this weeknight party. What brings them together? The Atto 3, an electric car by Chinese automaker BYD.
We have in the Telegram group lots of topics. We have one for knowledgeable staff, one for any problems we face in the car. There's always somebody in the group that advises. Because this group is not just a group, it's more like a family.
200 members last year, more than 1,200 this year. This family is growing fast on the back of booming sales. Their Chinese EV is on track to become one of Singapore's best sellers of 2024.
You get a pretty spacious car for a very good price if you compare to other brands around.
They have the technology, they have the quality, they have the experience.
China's 10 millionth EV rolled off the production line in November, driving a switch from petrol to electric, not just on the mainland, but around the world.
Chinese EVs already make up 60% of worldwide sales, and more in Indonesia and Thailand, 80%. Numbers are lower in the EU, but even there, the share of Chinese EVs jumped from less than 1% to 8% in 2023.
The success of Chinese cars has alarmed Europe and the US.
A 100% tariff on electric vehicles made in China. People say, wow.
US President Joe Biden announced that in May, saying China uses unfair, non-market practices and is dumping cars that harm American workers, businesses and communities. Months later, the European Union cranked up import taxes to as much as 45% because, it says, the battery EV value chain in China is benefiting from billions of yuan in unfair subsidization.
The European Commission argues it creates something of a level playing field. It will give the domestic car makers a little bit more time to maybe also catch up.
Western car makers have led the auto industry for 100 years, but theirs was the petrol engine. Can they now compete in electric?
If you think about BMW, Mercedes, the largest market for them in the world is China. But when you go to China these days and you see these sleek new Chinese EVs, you realize that those companies have tremendous competition now, because it's not about pricing.
It could be about the battery, which makes up as much as 40% of the cost of making an EV. BYD could be launching a new generation blade battery next year, while Zeekr, another Chinese automaker, unveiled a battery in August claiming to be the world's fastest charging EV battery, a 500-kilometer driving range on a 10.5-minute charge. With timelines like these, can tariffs hold off the competition?
At the end of the day, value addition and excellence in manufacturing comes from competition, not from getting protected by the government. And we have seen this across the world over decades of industrial policy experiments. I don't think this will be any exception.
It could also be bad for the planet.
It will be Americans who pay the tariff. It'll be a discouragement to China to produce more EVs, and that's actually bad for the world. We're in the midst of an energy transition. The world needs more electric vehicles.
A Trump presidency is almost certain to slow the EV transition in the US, while trade talks between Beijing and the EU continue as officials try to find a workaround.
The Europe and the US, they can do whatever they want, but as a consumer myself, I'm happy to see China come over here.
While politicians haggle over competition, consumers appear to be voting with their wallets. Tan Chiu-Yi, CNA, Singapore.
And that's all from me. Over to you, Oteli.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, China issues a warning against Manila's plan to buy America's Typhon mid-range missile system. South Korea's main opposition party is threatening to impeach acting President Han Duck-soo if he fails to launch a special investigation into President Yoon Suk-yeol's failed martial law bid. Well, the opposition Democratic Party is accusing Prime Minister Han of acting as a proxy to President Yoon. Han has held leadership roles in South Korean politics for 30 years under both conservative and liberal presidents. He was appointed to the PM role in 2022 by Mr. Yoon. The opposition passed a bill this month to appoint a special counsel to press charges of insurrection against Mr. Yoon and to investigate his wife over a luxury handbag scandal. And the party has warned it will immediately start impeachment proceedings against the prime minister if he doesn't approve the bills by tomorrow. Well, the anti-corruption body investigating Mr. Yoon want to question him on Christmas Day, but the president has refused a summons for questioning a second time. Prosecutors have warned they may seek an arrest warrant if he fails to comply. And if Mr. Yoon appears on Wednesday, he will become the first sitting South Korean president to face questioning by an investigative agency. Well, investigations continue into the 12 participants of Mr. Yoon's cabinet meeting shortly before he enacted martial law. The unification minister and spy agency chief are the latest to be questioned, leaving Mr. Yoon and his former defense minister Kim Yong-hyun the only participants left unquestioned. Police have also been analyzing Yoon's phone records as part of the probe. And earlier on Asia First, CNA spoke to Han Gil-soo, a professor of communications and media studies at Monash University. And we started by asking him how Mr. Yoon's refusal to accept legal documents about his impeachment trial may affect proceedings.
The constitutional court is pretty determined. It is possible to fill those 3 vacant seats, and also Democrat Party is really determined to do the right thing for the people. So Yoon could delay by some short period of time, and he will bring all his tactics. But I think justice will prevail, and what people want will be achieved at the end.
Professor Han, the Constitutional Court, I understand, is scheduled to make a statement today. And some experts believe it's important the judges outline how they intend to proceed with or without Yoon's cooperation on the documents. First of all, do you agree? And why is this statement going to be so important, as the whole process moves forward?
Now, Yoon is trying to manipulate some of the laws, and very much supported by the leading party. But I think there is a key issue that in terms of filling those 3 positions in the Constitutional Court. So there are 9 seats, and 3 of them are supposed to be nominated by the Parliament, and 3 by the head of Supreme Court, and also 3 by the President. So 3 vacant seats at present, they are supposed to be nominated by the Parliament. So that's the Korean National Assembly. So in terms of whether the acting president will actually have some say or not, he does not have any say. He actually has a very passive role rather than active role. So in that sense, that's what the Constitutional Court has also announced, and that's what they will proceed with. And I'm sure those 3 seats will be filled, but it is a matter of time, in my view.
In other news, China has warned the Philippines that it risks starting an arms race after Manila announced its plan to buy the US Typhon missile system to protect its interests at sea. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says that that is a provocative and dangerous move that could kick off what it calls a geopolitical confrontation. The U.S. Army deployed this mid-range missile system at joint military exercises in northern Philippines earlier this year. The land-based missile launcher has a range of 480 kilometers, and a longer-range version is also in the works. Philippine Army Chief Roy Galido said that the number of missile systems to be acquired would depend on economics. Well, the presence of the U.S. missile system on Philippine soil had angered China. Chinese and Philippine vessels have clashed several times in a disputed South China Sea over the past year, if you recall. China's Defense Minister Dong Jun warned in June that the deployment of the Typhoon system was seriously damaging regional stability. The president of Panama, Jose Raul Molino, says that sovereignty of the Panama Canal is, quote, non-negotiable, and that the waterway is controlled exclusively by his country, without influence from China, Europe, or the U.S. His words come after President-elect Donald Trump threatened to reimpose U.S. control over that key shipping route.
Because we're being ripped off at the Panama Canal like we're being ripped off everywhere else.
President-elect Donald Trump said on Sunday that the U.S. could reassert control over the Panama Canal, accusing Panama of charging excessive rates to use the Central American Passage.
The principles, both moral and legal, of this magnanimous gesture of giving are not followed, then we will demand that the Panama Canal be returned to the United States of America in full, quickly, and without question.
Trump made the comments at America Fest, an annual event organized by Turning Point, an allied conservative group. They came hours after he leveled a similar threat against Panama in a Saturday night post on Truth Social. Panamanian President Jose Raul Molino reaffirmed the country's sovereignty over the canal in a recorded statement on X, adding that Panama's sovereignty and independence are non-negotiable. The U.S. largely built the canal and administered territory surrounding it for decades. Accords were signed in 1977 that paved the way for the canal's return to full Panamanian control. The U.S. handed over control in 1999. The waterway accounts for 2.5% of global seaborne trade and is critical to U.S. imports of autos and commercial goods by container ships from Asia, and for U.S. exports of commodities, including liquefied natural gas. Trump also warned that he would not let the canal fall into, quote, the wrong hands.
It was solely for Panama to manage and not for China or any other country to manage. You see what's going on there?
China does not control or administer the canal, but a subsidiary of Hong Kong-based CK Hutchison Holdings has long managed two ports located on the Caribbean and Pacific entrances to the waterway. It is not clear how Trump would seek to regain control over the canal. His comments underline an expected shift in U.S. diplomacy under Trump, who has not historically shied away from threatening allies and using bellicose rhetoric when dealing with counterparts. They are also an exceedingly rare example of a U.S. leader saying he could push a sovereign country to hand over territory.
Meantime, Donald Trump has indicated that he would like to keep TikTok operating in the U.S. The president-elect cited the many views that his posts have received since he joined the video-sharing app in June.
We did go on TikTok, and we had a great response. We had billions of views, billions and billions of views. They brought me a chart, and it was a record, and it was so beautiful to see. And as I looked at it, I said, maybe we got to keep this sucker around a little while, you know.
The Supreme Court last week agreed to hear TikTok's appeal to a federal law that would ban the platform from U.S. app stores unless it divests from Chinese ownership. A hearing has been scheduled for January 10th, 9 days before the ban takes effect. And earlier we spoke with Jagruti Dave in Washington, D.C., and she's got more on the possible steps Mr. Trump might take to reverse TikTok's fortunes in the U.S.
Well, from that speech that he gave in Phoenix, Arizona, to a group of conservative supporters at an event there, it wasn't really clear whether there was anything tangible that he could do other than throw his weight behind TikTok. But, you know, in order to find out what he actually could do to reverse that April law, a few experts have suggested that he might have a couple of options. One of them could be to ask Congress to repeal that law. But they suggest that that is quite a difficult ask, perhaps because of the strong bipartisan consensus there is in Washington about the national security concerns that China poses and that TikTok potentially poses. Of course, TikTok has rejected those accusations. But there is also the other option that Donald Trump could ask his Attorney General when he takes office to not enforce the law. Now, that is also an unusual move, say experts, but also there's the issue subsequently that companies like Apple and Google, who sell the app, might choose not to take the legal risk of that decision. So basically, just because Donald Trump has authorized his Attorney General not to enforce the law, there's some uncertainty there, which companies might not want to play and jeopardize their company with. So those are potential options. But, you know, Donald Trump also takes office a day after that sell or be banned deadline that Congress has set. So it's unclear how much he could do if the decision doesn't go in TikTok's way. But of course, as you mentioned, before that, there is a hearing in the Supreme Court where the Supreme Court could be a potential lifeline for TikTok. But all this does show that, you know, Donald Trump has changed his position from being pretty tough on China and a critic of TikTok supporting that ban, turning from that to now talking about potentially saving TikTok in the United States.
Well, coming up on East Asia tonight, Vietnam's defense ministry and its army-owned telco signed nearly $300 million in contracts as the country's biggest defense expo wraps up. And a former U.S. Marine pilot set to be extradited from Australia to America over charges of illegally training China's military. You're watching East Asia tonight right here on CNA. Honda and Nissan officially begin merger talks to form the world's third largest automaker, which could happen by 2026 under a holding company. South Korea's main opposition party cracks the whip on acting President Han Duck-soo, threatening to impeach him if he doesn't launch a special investigation into President Yoon's failed martial law bid. And North Korea wants to send more troops to fight for Russia, even as its war zone casualties pile up. That's according to South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff. South Korea's military says that more than 1,000 North Korean soldiers have been killed or wounded alongside Russian troops in Ukraine. It follows reports that Pyongyang is preparing to deploy additional troops to aid Moscow's war effort. Seoul says that it detected signs that Pyongyang is producing and supplying more suicide drones. They were first unveiled during an inspection by leader Kim Jong-un last month. And that's on top of the multiple rocket launches and self-propelled artillery that North Korea has provided to Russia. Pyongyang so far has sent thousands of troops to reinforce Russian military. South Korea says that could be part of the North's efforts to gain practical warfare experience, as well as modernize its weapons system, both of which could pose a threat to Seoul. North Korea has been fortifying its heavily defended border that it shares with the South since April, reinforcing roads and installing anti-tank barriers. Vietnam's defense ministry and military-run telco Viettel have signed nearly $300 million in defense equipment contracts as the country's biggest defense expo wrapped up over the weekend. CNA's Tong No reports.
A birthday celebration of Vietnam's People's Army, established 80 years ago. Looking ahead, Vietnam wants to modernize its armed forces to protect its interests as it comes face to face with new geopolitical challenges.
Đảm bảo cán bộ chiến sĩ quân đội dám đánh, biết đánh và quyết đánh thắng mọi hình thái chiến tranh xâm lược, nhất là các hình thái chiến tranh mới, ứng phó hiệu quả với các thách thức an ninh phi truyền thống cũng như làm chủ các không gian chiến lược mới, bảo vệ vững chắc Tổ quốc Việt Nam xã hội chủ nghĩa trong mọi tình huống.
Vietnam has relied on its traditional ally Russia for its weaponry needs, but Hanoi sees a need to change that.
Cho nên là những cái tác động thì từ những cái cuộc xung đột Nga-Ukraine thì cũng là Việt Nam cũng không tránh khỏi những cái sự ảnh hưởng trên các lĩnh vực về kinh tế, về thương mại, rồi kể cả về những cái hoạt động về bảo đảm vũ khí quân sự. Và trong cái lịch sử của Việt Nam thì là chúng tôi cũng phải đồng ý và thừa nhận rằng ấy là trong cái lịch sử hình thành quân đội nhân dân Việt Nam và qua những cái cuộc chiến tranh thì những cái vũ khí trang bị của Việt Nam thì là có cái nguồn gốc từ Nga, từ đấy là Ukraine thì là những cái đấy là những cái điều chắc chắn là như vậy.
Vietnam has been seeking to diversify its defense suppliers. This shift has allowed international weapon manufacturers to compete for the country's growing defense needs. And this expo, organized by the Vietnamese Defense Ministry, was an opportunity for industry players from different countries to vie for a part in Vietnam's military modernization. Sources tell CNA Vietnam and the US are set to reach an agreement for a sale of C-130 military transport aircraft. In fact, the Vietnamese Prime Minister and Defense Minister were at the expo to inspect a C-130 on display. And at the conclusion of the expo, according to the organizers, 17 cooperation agreements were reached with countries including India, Belgium, France, and the US.
Our goal is to ensure that Vietnam has what it needs to defend its interests at sea, in the air, on the ground, and in cyberspace. It is a reflection of the United States' commitment to work with Vietnam as it seeks to advance its goals, to diversify and modernize its military. It's a reflection of the U.S. commitment to work with Vietnam to ensure that it has the capabilities Vietnam needs to defend its sovereignty, its independence, and its territorial integrity.
We look to the future, I could see better cooperation for maritime security operations in maritime domain awareness and allowing each other to better have maritime domain awareness for the ability to secure EEZ rights for sovereign rights for each country.
China also participated for the first time in such an expo in Vietnam with a showcase from Chinese defense manufacturer Norinco Group. Norinco gained media attention last year when reports suggested that Hamas had used its assault rifles in its conflict with Israel. Over 200 firms from 30 countries, including Iran and Israel, also took part. And organizers say 286 million US dollars worth of deals were signed by local businesses, double the value signed in the last edition in 2022. Tùng Ngô, CNA, Hà Nội.
For more insights into this Defense Expo, let's bring in Nguyen Hạc Zang, a visiting fellow, Vietnam Studies Program at ICE's Yusof Ishak Institute. Well, thanks, Dr. Nguyen, for joining us. So we heard there what Tong No said, 16 contracts worth over 300 million, thereabouts, which was double of what was signed in 2022. Tell us, in a nutshell, what does this mean for Vietnam's economic direction as well as its appeal to global investors?
Well, I think it's, if you look at the pure number, it's not really a big number for the, equipment and all the contracts that Vietnam signed. But as a part of Vietnam military expenditure, it's quite big because normally every year Vietnam spend around like 10 billion US dollars for military spending. So that's actually quite a lot of money for Vietnam. And secondly, I think organizing the expo is not about having more contract for Vietnam at the moment, but it's kind of like showing that Vietnam is willing to work with many partners around the world, from Russia to US to China and to Israel. So I think it's important to show that Vietnam is ready to engage with many partners around the world. And I think very importantly is that if you look at the expo, it's very weird situation when you see a lot of global rivals, Israel, Iran, Russia, and United States and China under the same expo in Hanoi. So I think it's kind of like showcase Vietnam's diplomatic capability as well. So I think the expo serves many goals for the Vietnamese state. And if you look at the way that the expo concluded, it's quite a success for Vietnam.
Yeah, I want to dig a little bit into that when you talk about, kind of like weird situation of rivals are coming in, included, big wigs, right? Like the Chinese firms. We talk about Norinco, which is China's major state-owned defense conglomerate. And when you've got, like Norinco there, for instance, what does it signal for regional defense dynamics?
Well, I think it's very hard to imagine that Vietnam will try to acquire any, Chinese military weapon. But the presence of a Chinese conglomerates at the expo, I think it's a very important signal because for China, it shows that China wants to maintain relevant player in Vietnam's military landscape. And it's kind of like a signal that it shows that we actually care about what's happening in Vietnam, military diversification. And also for Vietnam, it's important to show that, with the presence of a Chinese player, it shows that Vietnam is willing to engage with any countries, even with China, which it actually has a quite complex relationship because of the South China Sea dispute. So for Vietnam, I think it's important to really open the door for any players that want to engage with Vietnam militarily, although the prospect of Vietnam acquiring military equipment from specific countries really depend on its needs and its compatibility.
Yeah, and what's also perplexed, or rather I was quite perplexed by the fact that, at the same time, China was conducting the military drills near Vietnam, right, while it was holding this defense expo, basically to show that it wants to modernize its army. So should we read anything more into it? I mean, is there a message that China is also trying to send out at the same time?
Well, I think for China, any move is never, coincidental. It's something. It must be some reason behind that, because when Chinese Minister of Defense Dong Yun and its delegations in Hanoi, there was a military exercise inside Vietnam exclusive economic zone, and I think this served as a signal that even if Vietnam diversify its military cooperation and even it try to acquire more military equipment from US or from South Korea, China is always there there, and it's not easy for Vietnam to get over with that. And secondly, I think it's also important for Vietnam to to have a warning that despite all of those talk about modernization of Vietnam maritime capability, China still has upper hand, and Vietnam should be worried about that and should be pay more attention to China, even though they have more really capable partners now, especially the United States.
Right. And I was there was something you wrote in an article about how the war in Ukraine has exposed Vietnam's vulnerabilities of relying too heavily on Russian arms. So what opportunities do you see emerging from this push for diversification?
Well, I think it's very important to see that Vietnam acquires at least 70 or 80% of its arms from Russia. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine actually posed very difficult situation for Vietnam because of three main reasons. First, if you look at the way that Russian weapons is doing in Ukraine, it's not really a good advertisement because it's doing really badly. So Vietnam really has to defend itself by seeking to diversify away from that. And secondly, because of the risk of being sanctioned, if Vietnam continue to acquire Russian military hardware, I think especially from the threat of sanction from the United States, Vietnam really has to, to really defend its position, from that, because otherwise it will be a very big risk for Vietnam to be on the list of sanction. And third, I think importantly, Vietnam also wants to diversify away from the Russian system because it knows that in order to modernize a system, it has to acquire more modern weapons from other countries instead of Russia. And so I think this expo, the second time that Vietnam organized its military expo, is very important because it shows that Vietnam signal other partners that Vietnam wants to diversify its weapons. And I think if you look at the way that Vietnam's military equipment supply for the past 2 or 3 years, it actually tried to diversify it by acquiring more weapons from Israel, from India, which actually has the system which is quite compatible with Vietnam because its own depends on the Soviet-based system. And then there is the recent talk about Vietnam acquiring more equipment from the US, especially the C-130 that's acquired during the expo. I think it's a very important signal for Vietnam that it's trying to diversify away from Russia, not only because the Russian weapon is not doing really well, but also it serves Vietnam's strategic interest more by acquiring more weapons from other partners around the world.
Yeah, picking up from what you said about the U.S., there were these American companies, big ones like Boeing, Lockheed Martin. They were also there at the expo. I'm curious to think how far do you think U.S.-Vietnam defense ties can go from here? Especially we talked about potential technology transfers, joint production on the table, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think the recent deal that Vietnam made with the US is very historic because it marks the first time that Vietnam acquired a serious military hardware from US. Although it's non-lethal, it's only a transportation, helicopter. But also it's important to note that the deepening military tie between Vietnam and US is a part of the comprehensive strategic partnership that both countries signed last year, and it's on the trend of the upward trend of Vietnam's U.S. bilateral relation. But nevertheless, I think it would take a lot of time, maybe even decades, for Vietnam to acquire more weapons from the U.S. because of several reasons. The first is that the cost of acquiring U.S. military hardware is quite expensive comparing to traditional partners of Vietnam like Russia or Czech Republic or India. And secondly, because Vietnam and U.S. still have some differences over the ideology. Vietnam is still one-party state, and so maybe acquiring military hardware would require congressional approval, which may be quite difficult sometimes. And third, I think the military system in Vietnam is still heavily Russian-based and Soviet-based. So I think Vietnam still needs a lot of time to diversify away from that. And because of that, I think it would take some more time to see a really serious purchase of American weapons from Vietnam. But I think at the moment, the progress is quite great. If you look at like 40 years ago, the American weapons were used to fight against Vietnamese, and now all of those weapons are in the expo and to showcase for the Vietnamese, and Vietnamese is willing to buy American weapon. I think that's a really big progress for the former enemies, Vietnam and US becoming a strategic partner.
Massive step forward indeed. Thanks so very much for your time and thoughts. Always great chatting with you. Nguyen Hak Zhang from IC's Yusof Ishak Institute. Turning our attention to other news now, a former US Marine pilot is set to be extradited from Australia to America amid charges of illegally training China's military. Australia's Attorney General said that it approved the US request today. Daniel Dugan was arrested in Australia's New South Wales state in 2022, and this was shortly after he returned from China, where he had lived there since 2014. The naturalized Australian is accused of breaking arms control laws. It's alleged that he trained Chinese military pilots to land on aircraft carriers between 2010 and 2012. A 55-year-old Dugan has denied those charges, and his lawyers have argued there is no evidence the Chinese pilots he trained were from the military. They add that he was no longer an American citizen at the time of the alleged offences. He renounced his citizenship in 2016 in Beijing, backdated to 2012 on a certificate. Australia's Attorney General said that Dugan was given the opportunity to make representations, and all material was taken into consideration. Dugan's family says they are devastated and has slammed the decision as inhumane. Well, time now for another short break, but coming up in East Asia tonight. 20 years since the Indian Ocean Tsunami left a trail of devastation across Asia. We look at how survivors have rebuilt their lives. The Indian Ocean Tsunami back in 2004 was one of the worst natural disasters recorded in history, killing at least 225,000 people across a dozen countries. Indonesia's Aceh province bore the brunt of that tsunami, with the giant waves wiping out entire villages in just minutes. Well, Saiful Bara Ismail visits Aceh and looks at how the survivors are rebuilding their lives in the first part of a CNA series commemorating 20 years after the disaster.
The Baitur Rahman Grand Mosque is the symbol of religion, strength and struggle of the Acehnese people. The prominent building in Banda Aceh, the capital of Aceh province, survived the devastating earthquake and tsunami 2 decades ago. On 26 December 2004, a powerful 9-magnitude earthquake rocked the west coast of Sumatra near Aceh. The earthquake displaced an enormous volume of water, unleashing killer waves. One of the first signs of a tsunami was a sudden retreat of water from the beach. As the waves approach shallow water, they become compressed, causing them to grow in height up to 30 meters. The giant waves slammed into coastal communities, swallowing almost everything in its path. The tsunami killed an estimated 130,000 people in Aceh. The densely populated Banda Aceh was the worst hit, with some 60,000 people dead and many more missing.
There were more than 14,000 bodies buried in this mass grave after the devastating earthquake and tsunami flattened Banda Aceh in 2004. It is unknown who were buried here because there was no time to identify the bodies and give them proper funeral rites. Men, women, and people of different religions were all buried together in their final resting place. Some residents believe their loved ones are here and have placed tombstones to remember them.
Nahrawi was among the lucky ones to survive. The 50-year-old was out at sea that fateful day, but nothing could prepare him for what he was about to find out when he got back to shore.
Pasca tsunami, saya hidup sebatang kara, Pak. Semua keluarga saya habis. Pasca tsunami, saya ini pernah jadi relawan 3 bulan. Relawan artinya membantu orang-orang yang kena tsunami. Padahal saya korban tsunami. Tapi mungkin dengan saya bantu para korban ini, mungkin tenang jiwa raga saya itu, nggak teringat apapun.
Leah is another survivor who tries to make ends meet working in a local restaurant just off Banda Aceh. She was just 8 years old then during the tsunami and became an orphan overnight when both her parents were killed.
Ayah siap gempa, ayah mau ke laut dia kan nelayan. Dah dibilang sama tetangga nggak usah, tapi dia tetap mau ke sana karena dia kan pencari rezeki. Terus ke sana dia, itu nggak jumpa lagi. Susah ya beradaptasi. Pertama nggak bisa bobok kan, sering bobok sama mama kan. Harus kuat, karena nggak mungkin kan kita kayak ini terus. Kedepannya kita harus bisalah sendiri apa-apa Pak. Karena kok kita mengenang masa lalu kan itu nggak bangkit-bangkit Pak.
It is Friday afternoon and businesses in Banda Aceh are closing for a few hours. Shop owners are preparing to attend Friday prayers at the nearby Baitur Rahman Grand Mosque. Aceh province is predominantly Muslim and the Acehnese are firm believers in destiny.
Kita hidup, kita berusaha untuk bertahan. Setelah itu apa yang terjadi itu kuasa Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Jadi dengan percaya itu sebagai takdir, itu kodrat yang harus diterima. Sehingga setelah kejadian tsunami itu orang Aceh menjadi tidak cengeng. Itu kekuatan masyarakat kota Banda Aceh dengan ketaatannya sebagai muslim yang percaya itu ujian yang diberikan Tuhannya.
Perhaps it was also destiny when peace finally prevailed in Aceh after struggling in a decades-long armed conflict. The tsunami led to a peace agreement between the Free Aceh Movement or GAM and the Indonesian government, bringing an end to the insurgency. Afrizal was a former GAM company commander and he was in the separatist camp in the mountains when the tsunami struck the coast of Aceh.
Turun ke bawah, saya bilang. Apapun resiko kita hadapi. Kita di sana punya musuh, tetapi kondisi seperti ini kita tidak bisa diamin juga. Tadi saya bilang sama kawan-kawan, saya lempar senjata. Kita tidak ada guna lagi berperang karena ada yang banyak yang minta tolong di bawah. Sehingga hari pertama dengan hari kedua kami membantu para pengungsi yang ada di pengungsian masing-masing.
Banda Aceh is now thriving 20 years after the tsunami. The city and its people have risen from the ashes of destruction, but the anguish will remain forever etched in the memories of the Acehnese. Saiful Bahari Ismail, CNA, Banda Aceh, Indonesia.
Well, the catastrophic disaster on the 26th of December 2004 was triggered by one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded. But what caused the quake and why was it so destructive? Shahida Othman explains.
To understand the scale of the disaster, we need to look at the forces beneath our feet. The tsunami was caused by the movement of tectonic plates. The Earth's surface is made up of large plates that float on molten rock. Now, these plates are constantly moving, and where they meet, powerful forces are at work. The 2004 earthquake occurred along the boundary between two of these plates. Over time, stress built up as the plates pushed against each other. Eventually, when that stress became too great, nature's fury was unleashed. The resulting release of energy was catastrophic. It displaced huge volumes of water, triggering the deadly tsunami waves that followed. Understanding how it happened is key to preventing future disasters. Scientists study tectonic activity to identify earthquake-prone areas and improve early warning systems. While we cannot predict exactly when a major earthquake will strike, knowing which regions are most vulnerable can help authorities issue timely warnings. This gives people crucial time to evacuate and prepare, which can mean the difference between life and death. Thanks to advances in technology and better public education, we're now better equipped to respond more quickly in the event of another major earthquake. And knowing the science behind these events is vital in making sure the tragedy of 2004 never repeats.
CNA's week-long special coverage marking the 20th anniversary of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami continues. Tomorrow we will take a look at the critical role of an early warning system for such a disaster. And that is all we've got for you in East Asia tonight this Monday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia and look us up on Facebook and on YouTube. Thanks for watching.